Okay, so Garry Kasparov, who many consider the best chess player of all time, and I'm going to make a case in the lecture tonight, and also a case in part 2, which will be in late February, the last Wednesday of February, why that may be an apt title, because Kasparov's reign at the top of the chess world was lengthy, and even though his lifetime rating was lower than that of Magnus Carlsen, even Magnus Carlsen admits that if you were to convert Garry's 1993 rating to a 2014 rating, it would be higher than Carlsen's current rating. Anyway, so for those of you who are attending your first time or watching first time at home, I'm Lucas Anderson. I'm a librarian by day, so I like reading books and researching and talking about it. So I'm going to be presenting the biography of Kasparov. And then Warren Harper, who's a FIDE master, will be providing analysis of some of Kasparov's best games. Here's Warren in action. A couple weeks ago, Warren did a blindfold simul at my school, at the Audi International School. I'm in the background making the moves for him. And he took on 5 teams of students and faculty members who are players on our chess team, and over the course of an hour proceeded to thrash all of them. So impressive display. So let's get started with Garry Kimovich Kasparov. The first thing you may not know is that that was not his name when he was born. He was born Garrick Weinstein, and I hope I'm saying Weinstein right. My Russian is not that great. So he changed his name, and we're going to get into that in a bit. But for now, understand that when he was born, his name was Weinstein, and it stayed Weinstein until he was 12. And so when you look at early press reports about his success, you'll see him referred to by that name. Okay, so Kasparov was born the only child of Kim and Clara, Kim Weinstein and Clara Gasparian is her name because she is Armenian, and Kim Weinstein is a Soviet Jew, and they were both engineers. They met in a factory where they both worked in Azerbaijan. They both came from fairly prominent families, which we'll discuss here in a bit. Now, Garry had a charmed childhood in the sense that he had 2 loving parents, strict but loving parents who provided him quite a bit of attention, but a tragic childhood in that his father, Kim, died when Garry was 7 years old. This is in 1971. Garry lists the cause of death as lymphatic sarcoma. I've seen other places report leukemia. I'm not an oncologist, so I can't distinguish to determine which is the appropriate name. But the point is, Kim, and by the way, Kim was not named Kim because it's a feminine name. He was named Kim because it stands for some long-winded Russian thing which translates into English as Communist Youth International. So he's named after an organization because Kim's father was a patriotic communist. Died when Garry was 7 years old, and Garry actually was not allowed to visit his father in the hospital. He was not allowed to attend his father's funeral because the concern was that Garry did not have the mental fortitude to accept that. As a result, Garry acted as if his father were still alive for a couple of years, from the ages of 7 to say 10 or so. He puts it in his book, almost daring someone to tell him the truth. So after his father died, Garry and his mom Clara moved in with Clara's parents, that Susanna and Shagan Kasparov, and lived with them for many years throughout the formative years of his childhood. By the way, Clara Kasparov, Garry's mother, is still alive. In the photo below, you see her at present. Reportedly, Vichy Anand is sitting across the table, and he said something to kind of make fun of Garry, and Clara didn't find it funny. That's the story. So, Garry was raised in Baku in Azerbaijan. Baku at the time was a part of the Soviet Union. As you can see, at present it is bordered by the Russian Federation, by Georgia, by Armenia, which is where Petrosian is from, and Baku is also, incidentally, where Levon Aronian is from, and it's bordered by Iran. Now, I want to bring your attention to a fairly weird aspect of this map, and I want to point it out to you, which is this region right here. This is actually part of Azerbaijan, and it's called the Karabakh region. And it was given, and I've heard it described as kind of like the Swiss mountains. And it was given to Azerbaijan by Stalin as thanks for Baku's role, or Azerbaijan's role, in assisting the Soviet war effort in World War II. See, Baku is an energy hub. They have lots of oil and petroleum products there in the Caspian Sea. It's similar to Houston in that respect, actually, that it's kind of a center of drilling, and the energy fields or oil fields are very well known. And that fueled the Russian war effort, which allowed them to resist on the Eastern Front against Germany during Operation Barbarossa. So the Karabakh region, Nagorno-Karabakh, or Karabakh Mountains, as it translates, is a contentious region that is ethnically Armenian, and we're going to find out later on that that's going to pose some problems. But anyway, Garry had a charmed childhood. Here he is playing backgammon with his father and his uncle. Garry was a very promising young boy. Now, Baku was ethnically mixed. You had ethnic Azeris, you had Armenians, Jews, Soviets, and combinations of those. Later on, that ethnic diversity caused ethnic tension and ultimately ethnic unrest, as we'll get to. So Garry's father was from a family of musicians. His father was a violinist and a fairly accomplished violinist. His paternal grandfather was a composer and a conductor for the Baku Philharmonic. His uncle, Leonid Weinstein, was a composer of operas, of songs, film scores. And when Garry was young, the question was, would he become a musician or an engineer? You know, this is when Garry is 5 years old. But Garry, as you might imagine, showed talent elsewhere. At the age of 5, he was introduced to chess by his parents, both of whom played and both of whom enjoyed the game. And the story goes that they were looking at a puzzle that was printed in a local newspaper. And they couldn't figure out the solution, and Garry, at age 5, without ever being taught the rules of chess, figured it out. This is the story. And his father figures at that point that he's showing a talent for it. So he starts teaching him the rules of the game. And Kasparov says, quote, "Soon I was inseparable from chess, and a year later I was already beating my father." So Garry talks about he credits his ability with chess to his memory. We've talked about this for a couple of other players. Karpov, for example, showed phenomenal memory. Kasparov is the same, and his memory and his ability to learn is the stuff of legend in the Soviet Union, as we'll find out. But he took to chess very quickly, and his father quickly proposed that he focus his efforts on chess as opposed to music, and his mother, who was quite the chess player herself, firmly supported that decision. Later on, and we're talking like 1981, Clara quits her job as an engineer to become Garry's manager full-time and gets a stipend from the Soviet government and all that. Now, Karpov developed in somewhat of a vacuum. He didn't have any formal coaches until he started to show very strong talent around age 10. With Kasparov, it was quite different. Kasparov was taken to the local Pioneers Palace, and this is the gajillionth time I mentioned the Pioneers Palace as an important turning point in the development of a Soviet chess player. He was taken to the Pioneer Palace by his uncle, Konstantin Gregorian. He called him Uncle Kotik. That was, his uncle was the husband of his mother's sister. And he took Garry to the Pioneers Palace on September 3rd, 1970. So Garry is 7 years old at the time. And this is before his father passes away, but his father is ill at this point. His first real coach, beyond his uncle, was Oleg Privorotsky, who's pictured there at left. And Privorotsky quickly remarked upon Kasparov's talent. He said, "I don't know whether there have been similar beginners in other towns, but there is been no one like him in Baku. So he quickly realized Kasparov's potential, worked with him. By age 7, Kasparov was a third category player. We're talking like 1600 ELO, I suppose. By age 8, second category, so closer to 1800 ELO. By age 9, he's almost 2000 ELO, and he's playing in adult tournaments. His first mention in the news comes at age 9 when they reported, quote, among the 14 winners of the second stage were 13 candidate masters and a second category player. So this was June 1972. Kasparov had entered a tournament consisting almost entirely of adults and and candidate masters, and Kasparov finished as highly as the candidate masters as a second category player, just to show you that his skill oftentimes outpaced his classification. We're going to see that later on. Now, he obviously caught the eye of various people. He caught the eye of Alexander Shakarov. In 1973, Shakarov was the trainer of the Baku Junior Championship, or he was an arbiter, sorry, of the Baku Junior Championship, where Garry tied for third as a 9-year-old. And later on, Shakarov trained the Azerbaijani junior team, of which Kasparov played a part. And then soon after that, Kasparov in August of 1973 meets Mikhail Botvinnik, the patriarch of Soviet chess, and Kasparov quickly becomes Botvinnik's favorite student. You might imagine, with the potential that he showed, he quickly caught his eye. So, according to Alexander Nikitin, and we're going to get to him in a moment, Botvinnik, quote, became visibly younger when chatting with the boy, who immediately became his favorite pupil. So Botvinnik gets, he mobilizes a lot of chess resources to support Kasparov's rise. One of the first things he does is he arranges for Oleg Pravoratsky, to work with Kasparov 4 times a week in his house. So Pravoratsky shows up, tutors Garry in chess 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week, Garry goes to group lessons with Shakarov. And by the end of 1973, he's earned his first candidate master norm. He's 10 years old. Garry also spent quite a bit of time with Alexander Nikitin, and their relationship began in July 1973 and lasted until, I want to say 1990 or I believe 1990, March of 1990. So they had a very long and fruitful relationship. Now, Nikitin at the time was a state trainer for the USSR Sports Committee, and Nikitin was on Kasparov's team. He helped him prepare for World Championships. He helped him analyze his games, prepare openings, you name it. Nikitin did it, and was probably his biggest advocate until they parted ways in 1990. We'll get to the reasons why. Incidentally, Nikitin is still alive and healthy, and this is him teaching a class a couple of years ago, in fact.
Now, is it just me, or does Nikitin look like Harrison Ford?
He does look like Harrison Ford. In the 1970s, yeah, he does. Okay, so let's talk about Kasparov's prodigious rise. I've mentioned it a little bit before. Botvinnik said something quite prophetic. He said the future of chess lies in the hands of this young man. That was in 1974. Azrian, another Soviet GM says, quote, one was struck by his astounding combinative talent. He attacked with enormous power and he calculated variations uncommonly quickly and very deeply. Now, in February of 1975, Leonard Bardin wrote the article, which I have for you on this slide, in the Guardian newspaper, where he said that an 11-year-old by the name of Garry Weinstein from Baku would likely challenge and beat Karpov in 1990. Now, this is 1975, and Garry is not yet 12 years old, but and he's already attracting the attention of Western journalists. This is, as you can imagine, somewhat remarkable. Incidentally, if you look in the same article, so this is the part on Kasparov right here, but if you look down below, he talks about the potential of certain English prospects who might one day rival Karpov, and he's talking about, among other people, Nigel Short, who's also showing great potential. I think he was 2 years younger than Kasparov, so he would have been like 9 or 10 at the time. But Leonard Bardin was also somewhat prophetic. So by 1975, Kasparov has obtained his first candidate master norm. He has attended several sessions with Botvinnik at his chess school in Moscow, and with Botvinnik's help, Garry actually secures state sponsorship in the form of a monthly stipend of 120 rubles per month, which and also some food coupons. Now, this was a great boon for the family. Understand that after Kasparov's father died, Clara still worked, but with one income. Obviously, living with her parents helped, but with one income, the money was somewhat tight. So by obtaining a monthly stipend and food coupons, it certainly helped the family out and certainly helped justify the decision to spend so much time on Garry's chess. Now, you'll notice in this article at age 11, Garry is referred to by his birth name, in this case, Garry Weinstein. So this would be toward the end of the time that he'd be referred to that way, because in 1975, when Kasparov turned 12, he became legally able to petition to have his name changed, and he does that. Now, I want to read for you what Kasparov writes in his book, Garry Kasparov on Garry Kasparov, Part 1. This is 1973 to 1985. And I'm reading from page 45. And he's talking about a tournament in July of 1975. And he says, "This tournament was the last in which I played under the surname Weinstein. In August 1975, at a family council of the Weinsteins and Kasparovs, it was decided that I should take the surname of my mother, which she had not changed when she married." Now remember, her name was actually Gasparian, but if you Russify it, it becomes Kasparian and then Kasparova, if you want to give it the feminine version. So he says, and I'll resume, "It seemed natural to become a Kasparov. For nearly 5 years I had been brought up in my mother's family and had grown up under the care of my grandfather Shagin, who had no sons. But the real implication of what happened was revealed to me much later." Now this is Alexander Nikitin, a quote from him. "Changing surname is a delicate process. While normal with women, it very rarely occurs with men, and only as a rule when it is obligatory. The main burden in the fight to carry out the judicial formalities and, more important, to convince all the relatives and friends of the correctness of the decision fell on Garrick's mother. How many unpleasant hours Clara had to endure, how many tears were shed. A year before that, with Botvinnik's agreement, I began insistently trying to convince her of the need to change her son's surname. I had no doubts about the boy's brilliant chess future. From my work in the USSR Sports Committee, I knew what inexplicable problems, not at all to do with chess, could suddenly be encountered by a youth with a, quote, incorrect surname, and how his sports career could be imperceptibly hindered or even altogether ruined. My fears were justified. Much has now been written about the talent, about the latent anti-Semitism, especially in the upper echelons of Soviet power. I am convinced that Garry Weinstein would not have got through to a world championship match with Anatoly Karpov either in 1984 or in 1987. They would not have allowed it. He would have been eliminated at the distant approaches. At that time, the system worked meticulously." So, Kasparov says in his book, Child of Change, which was published in 1987, that he changed his name to Kasparov because on his father's side, he did have a male cousin, a son of Leonidstein, his uncle, someone to carry on the Kasparov name, or the Weinstein name, but there was no male heir on the Kasparov side. So he says in that book that he did it for secession reasons, if you will, or family reasons. In this book, we get an idea that there's more of a political bent to it, and I don't know that Kasparov acknowledges it fully, but I think 12-year-old Kasparov was probably quite aware that his career would be facilitated by making his name more Soviet. This is not the first time, incidentally, that Kasparov would make some sort of change or compromise something in an effort to advance his career. So Kasparov, as you might imagine, achieved successes quite early. In 1975, he participated in a simul with Karpov. There's their first meeting. Kasparov kicks himself for losing this. He said he had what he thought was a winning position, but this was part of a simul. And when Karpov beat all the other opponents, he came and spent just all of his time in front of Kasparov, and that was the only, and that was why he lost. And then against Korchnoi, he drew actually, and you can see Garry very studiously notating his moves, and Korchnoi just kind of sitting back and making his moves. In October of 1975, Garry wins the Baku City Cup convincingly. He's 12 years old. In 1976, in January, he becomes the USSR junior champion. In July of 1976, he participates in his first World Junior Championship, and he ties for third. He's 13 years old. In 1977, he again finishes third in the World Junior Championship. 1978, he said it's kind of a make or break year. At this point, he can either choose to go to college, become an engineer, follow in his father's footsteps. He could study literature. He had all these different interests. There was no limit to what he could study, or he could make a go of playing chess professionally. And so he decided to make it his mission to get norms and get tournament wins and see if he had what it took to compete at the highest level. So his first big tournament was the Sokolsky Memorial Trophy in Minsk, where he won his first, or he encountered his first grandmaster in classical play and won. We'll see that in a moment. He ended up winning this tournament with 13 out of 17. Now, he needed 9.5 out of 17 to get a master norm and therefore become a USSR Master of Sport. He hit that mark and then some by scoring 13 out of 17. So then he played in Latvia, he played in, and he qualified there for Russia's top chess league. And incidentally, there were 18 players in that chess league. Garry was the only person without an ELO rating, and 16 of the other players were grandmasters. People like Tal, Geller, Polugaevsky, Bagarov, etc. And so here he was, this 15-year-old kid, no ELO rating, or he's a master, but competing against 16 grandmasters, and not just 16 grandmasters, some of the top players in the world at the time. And he held his own. Tal said, quote, "He's an astonishingly talented junior. The result of his first performance in the top league is an outstanding sporting achievement. It is reasonable to assume Garrick will make further big progress." And we'll see soon that he did. But before we do, let's look at our first game, which was from the Sokolsky Memorial Tournament, in which Kasparov played his first match against a grandmaster. And I probably already spoiled it for you by telling you he wins. But for that, I will turn it over to Warren.
Thanks, Lucas. I mean, his achievement of beating the first grandmaster he ever played is pretty astonishing. I mean, I can't think of anybody else who has ever done that. I mean, it's so amazing because if you've never experienced that level of play, it's difficult. I mean, this would be like some random tennis player playing, Rafael Nadal or something in his first tennis match and beating him. It's just, it's hard to conceive because, facing that kind of competition changes the game of chess, the way it operates, right? So I find it amazing. And if there is somebody else who's done it, I would be shocked. I mean, to me, it's like, if you compare it to baseball, it'd be like hitting 4 home runs in your first baseball game in the majors. It's a pretty amazing feat. And also his tournament performance was, like Lucas mentioned, he got 13 points out of 17. Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. And his comments on the tournament are kind of interesting too. So this game was played in the last round, and some other games, according to what happened, he had to win to get first place. So if he just draws, then he's not going to be able to win the tournament. So apparently the way he thought at the time was, well, I've got to win. Even though he's playing his first GM, he has kind of an optimistic, really kind of go-get-him attitude. He clearly had no thoughts of, oh, I'm playing a grandmaster, a draw would be great. He had higher ambitions. So let's see what happens. So the opening is a little bit bizarre. He kind of took advantage of Black's odd move order. So while playing d6 on the second move here, he's trying to play e4 right away. Because likewise, if black's trying to go into a king's Indian and you play g6, now knight c3 makes less sense because black can play d5 and control his e4 square. So he kind of takes advantage of black's little bit odd move order. Not that it's a bad opening for black, but I think Ludikov was not very experienced in this opening. So now Kasparov plays e4, and here is Ludikov's first mistake. So, I mean, standard moves here would be like c6, defending b7, which may not look important, but you'll see why in a minute, or like e6, just taking some more control over the center. And e6 especially would be interesting because of what Kasparov plays later, okay? But he plays knight b7, and it's his mistake because of e5. And the problem here is that if black were to say take, taking on e5 is not to be recommended because white wins this b pawn, and it's black's position's got a lot of light squared holes, and this is not good. So unfortunately, black's position is already not going in the right direction. He's already had to retreat his knight, and Kasparov is famous for his energetic play. So moving your knight back and forth a couple times, as you can imagine, this is Kasparov's element. This is when he plays his best chess, I think. So trying to get rid of the bishop. Again, black can't win the e-pawn because of this weakness on b7. And now it looks like black might escape because on the next move, he plays like b6, and it's not clear what white's going to be able to do. White has more space, but no concrete threats. So knowing Kasparov, what do you think he played?
e6.
Right, exactly. So since black is going to get a solid game with e6, let's just stop that. Yeah, so that's this is the kind of sacrifice that most experienced chess players won't really have to calculate because you know it's correct to delay the development of this bishop, right? Now it's pretty amazing that at that age he was able to identify this because he's been a concrete player all his life. So for him to play this without necessarily calculating the consequences is pretty impressive. So now white's already threatening queen h5 and mates, right? And black cannot guard this e6 pawn already. Although the key point is the delayed development of this bishop, right? And here, Kasparov didn't play perfectly, though. Castles was a slight mistake. It was better to castle queenside. And the importance of that move is to get the rook to the d file, which may not look important, but you'll see why it was in a second here. So here, Kasparov makes another mistake. He plays bishop g5. Now it looks scary, and Ludikov, believed his bluff. It looks like taking this pawn is risky. What Kasparov had in mind was actually knight takes d5, followed by bishop b5, with the idea of playing rook d1 and rook e1, and it looks like it's kind of hard to play for black, right? So apparently Ludikov bought this idea, but turns out bishop f6 is fine for black. He's able to guard e7 point, so it's not an issue. But Ludikov believed Kasparov and didn't take it. And by the way, the reason that castling queenside would have been better is that in this position, if you imagine white's king on c1 and the rook on d1, already white is threatening the bishop and it can take on d5, and it's just much faster. So if he had castled queenside, he could have played bishop g5. But Ludikov believed Kasparov. I mean, I haven't seen any pictures of him playing when he was a little kid, but I imagine he was just as fiery as he was when he was an adult. So that may have influenced Ludikov. Now the queen retreats and is able to defend that guy. Now the knight's already threatening to jump to c5. So plays king f7. b6 was probably also fine. Now this move is very interesting. The first point is that taking this pawn is not a good idea because of knight c5. And white's threatening e6, and if you play like rook e8, then rook b1, and then you take on b7. And the arrival of that rook into the game is going to spell doom for black. But he's playing a grandmaster, so he sees this tactic worth guarding the pawn. Now Kasparov's trying to open up this position for his bishops. Now this move is also pretty amazing for such a young kid to find. I mean, especially young Kasparov, who's very aggressive and energetic, right? To play a knight backwards to the back rank. These kind of moves are always tricky to find psychologically for that very reason, right? Moving backwards just doesn't usually cross our minds, right? We're thinking of how to go forward. So it really shows his chess maturity at such a young age to find a backwards move like that. I find it pretty remarkable. Of course, the point of this is to be able to open up the position further with c4. So move by move, he's starting to pry open the center. Just moving the queen away so that now he can move this knight without trading queens. Knight e4 was also possible, but Kasparov didn't want to play this because it trades queens. And, like I've already mentioned, he was playing for a win. So this was not an acceptable result. It looks like black is beginning to get some kind of coordination, but unfortunately, white's going to be able to open up the center pretty soon. And black's king is still not well placed. So it looks like Ludikov was going to take on c4, but this will just double black's pawns, and Kasparov is just kind of daring him to take it. He's going to push to a5 and either force him to take or retreat his knight backwards where it came from. Now the bishop arrives on the juicy c6 square. And it's really it's kind of impressive how black's pieces are just so passive. I mean, it's although his moves, I think his moves look kind of natural, but it's still impressive to play with such energy move after move. I mean, here you might consider moves like, I don't know, rook e1, right? Or if it was me, I'd probably save my bishop, But he just plays with such great energy. It's really fun to watch. Now this move is very clever, always concrete, threatening bishop d6. And the knight gains a g5 square. So this move is especially strong. Now this move does guard the d6 square, but it allows him to invade on the 7th. And now he wins the exchange by force. Now, although black has a couple pawns, the openness of his king and the fact that his pawns are so separated makes this a pretty tough position to hold. Now queen e4, threatening rook takes d5. Now the knight comes in and invades. Now the rook is also interested in coming down here. Already rook b8 is threatened. Now he's threatening queen g6, and he's threatening a couple different mates. So Ludikov had to exchange into an endgame. But this is a pretty easy win for white. And with the extra exchange, he finally gave up. So, I mean, I think this game is really impressive. I mean, if you showed this game to me and didn't tell me who the players were, I would definitely think white was, probably a pretty strong grandmaster. But at the time, he was basically just a master. I mean, comparable would be him being like 2200, basically. I mean, for him to play this game, it's amazing. I mean, you can clearly tell that he was stronger than 2200 at that time. His tournament win is also impressive because he was basically the weakest player in that tournament, and he wins it. In a field of that many strong players, it's incredible. I mean, I can't think of anything comparable that's ever happened, where the lowest seed would win a tournament in a field like that. So, any questions about that game? Yeah, by today's standards, some people might think, oh, you know, he was 15 years old. You know, Karyakin was already a grandmaster when he was 12. You know, but you know, for that time, that was still pretty fast. I mean, the youngest grandmaster at that point in time was still Bobby Fischer, the youngest person to achieve it at 15, right? So, comparably, it was a pretty amazing feat for that time. All right. That's all I have for that.
So 15 years old, wins his first tournament. You might think that this is a fluke and that if he were against tougher competition that he wouldn't do nearly as well. Well, the next notable tournament that he participated in actually started on his 16th birthday. And I'll show you the cross table, but at a glance you can tell a couple things. First, Kasparov won. Second, Kasparov won by 2 points. Third, Kasparov was one of 2 non-grandmasters in the tournament. In fact, he has no title at all. The other one who had no title at all scored 7.5 points lower than he did. So, and if I can add another, Kasparov did not lose a single game in this tournament. So, let me tell you a little bit more about this tournament. This was Banja Luka in Yugoslavia. This was April 1979. As I mentioned, it was when Kasparov turned 16 at the very first day of the tournament. And as was common at this point, remember, this is after Korchnoi has defected, and Korchnoi's family is still held in Soviet Russia, and the Soviets are somewhat concerned about people defecting. And so the typical tactic is, until you have the trust of the Soviet regime and then the KGB, your family needed to stay behind. So Kasparov was actually sent to this tournament without his trainer, without Alexander Nikitin, and without his mother. And so the person who was entrusted to take care of Kasparov was none other than Petrosian, whose name is spelled a little differently there in the number 4 spot. So the story goes, now remember, Petrosian is Armenian and Kasparov's mother is Armenian. The story goes that they call ahead and they go and knock on Tigran Petrosian's door, and they're welcomed into the house, and they ask him if he will look over young Garry. And Petrosian gracefully offers to do so. And so at the tournament, Kasparov says, quote, "The help of Iron Tigran proved invaluable. His humor, genuine benevolence, and wise advice created a good atmosphere. In our free time, we talked a lot, and not only about chess topics. We went for walks together, gave simuls, analyzed, and discussed games we had played. In fact, they played in the first round, and they drew." So Kasparov had and this is common for Kasparov, he has a kind of a father figure in Petrosian. Kasparov had many of them. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, Provoretsky, Nikitin. He had many different proxy fathers, if you will, and Petrosian became something of another. And if you recall, Petrosian as an erstwhile KGB agent, having Petrosian on your side and having Rona Petrosian on your side was quite valuable at this time. Now, the Yugoslavs, this tournament was in Yugoslavia, they were insulted. One grandmaster, his name was Vukic, I think it's pronounced, he protested vehemently about Kasparov's participation. They're sending us boys, they're sending us children. Well, Kasparov beat him.
Did he say that before the tournament?
Yes. Yeah. At the opening of the tournament, he said that, and then they were paired in like round 5 or 6, and Kasparov beat him. And apparently the audience applauded. Following on the heels of this tournament, this is in 1979. 1980, he attends the World Junior Championship in Dortmund in Germany, and he wins. Second place there, by the way, is Nigel Short, looking away from the camera. Yeah. He wins first place. He becomes World Junior Champion. And surprisingly enough, he was the highest rated person in this tournament. Now, he didn't have an ELO in the Banja Luka tournament. the Russian Federation, or the Russian Federation knew what his rating was because of his participation in the Russian Chess League, but they didn't tell him. And his performance rating at Banja is 2695, which for a 16-year-old is kind of good. His ELO after the tournament was published to be for the first time. His first published ELO was 2545, which would qualify him for the title of grandmaster. He just needed to get more norms. And he actually got his second GM norm in April of 1980, which was the only needed 2 at the time. So he got the GM title in April 1980 with a win in Baku, Azerbaijan, actually. So he went into the World Junior Championship as a grandmaster. And Botvinnik was actually opposed to his participation. He said, you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. You're going in there as the highest rated player, so there's just going to be an expectation that you win. And if you win, great. And if you lose, it's going to be a scandal. But Kasparov was never one to shy away from competition, A. And B, he says he felt that he owed it to the Soviet Sports Committee, who had, paid his stipend and provided him with trainers and this, that, and the other. So he went and participated, and he won anyway. And Botvinnik, if you remember from the Soviet School of Chess lesson, could hold a grudge. And he would tell people by phone, I'll speak to you in a year, and hang up the phone and then write their name down. He did give Kasparov the silent treatment after this tournament, and they were not on speaking terms for a while. But Kasparov's mother intervened, and Botvinnik relented, and you can't ostracize your favorite student for too long. So he became World Junior Champion in 1980. The following year, he won the USSR Championship at the ripe old age of 18. You could tell, first of all, there are some prominent names that did not participate in this tournament, among them Karpov, because Karpov was preparing for his title defense against Korchnoi in Italy. And you can also see that Kasparov tied for first place. He shared first place. On tiebreakers, he would actually finish second, but the USSR Chess Federation simply declared them co-champions, as they typically did when 2 players had the same record. You'll see that he went into the tournament with the highest ELO rating. This is 18-year-old Kasparov, and the only person who was even close was Belyavsky, and his name comes up quite a bit in the future. He ended up training Kasparov in 1990. Kasparov wins, or shares the title for the USSR Championship at age 18. That was a record. The previous record, does anybody know who had it? Who won it at age 20? Botvinnik. So Kasparov has exceeded the feat of his trainer, if you will. So it looked, for all intents and purposes, that in the current candidate cycle, after Karpov defended his world championship, that in 81, it looked, for all intents and purposes, that in 84, the person who might challenge him for that title was Garry Kasparov, but it wasn't that easy. There was actually quite a bit of opposition to Kasparov becoming the challenger for a couple of reasons. Number one, Karpov had assumed the world championship in unlucky circumstances. Through no or very little fault of his own. You could argue that he could have acceded to Fischer's wishes and they would have played in 75, but he probably would have lost. You could argue that Karpov was essentially handed the championship because he beat Korchnoi in the candidates and because Fischer refused to defend his title. But since he acquired the title, he defended it admirably, notably against the evil defector Korchnoi in 78 and 81. And so he had the respect and the support of the Soviet authorities, and they did most. Kasparov makes it sound like they went out of their way to try to suppress him, and there is some evidence for that, but I don't think it's as bad as Kasparov makes it out to be. But the point is that there was deep concern about Kasparov challenging Karpov for the title. The Soviets didn't really want that to happen. I don't know who they wanted to challenge Karpov, but they didn't want the division that would be caused by 2 Soviets who were participating. And so there was some maneuvering. Some of the maneuvering, Kasparov felt like he was in a pretty good place, but he needed more experience and he needed to play more international grandmasters. So he went looking for tournaments. Where's there some good competition in tournaments that are really going to help me develop as a player so that I can get the kind of experience under my belt to pose a challenge to Karpov in '84. And so he identifies a couple tournaments, and he submits his application to the Soviet authorities to attend them, thinking it's just going to be a easy rubber stamp, and they actually reject his request to play in a tournament in Yugoslavia in 1982. So Kasparov was thwarted. So what he did was he formed a fairly powerful friendship and obtained a pretty powerful ally of his own, and that came in the person of Haydar Aliyev. Haydar Aliyev was the leader of Soviet Azerbaijan from 1969 to 1982, and then he was president of Azerbaijan after that country's independence from 1993 till his death in 2003. He was a member of the Politburo, so he was a member of the upper echelons of the Communist Party. He was very well connected to Brezhnev and to other Soviet premiers, and he had power, and he was a supporter of the young Azerbaijani player Garry Kasparov. And so Kasparov essentially called him and asked for his help, and he basically said, "You're going to play." Sure enough, his application gets approved, and off he goes to play in Yugoslavia. Aliyev would intervene several times in the future on Kasparov's behalf. I'll tell you about another incident upcoming pretty soon. And then later on, he plays an interesting geopolitical role in events happening in Azerbaijan during the kind of the glasnost and fall of the Soviet Union. Now, so Kasparov blames persecution on the Soviet chess establishment, and specifically on Anatoly Karpov. So I want to read you a quote from Kasparov's 1987 book. See, you thought Nakamura was the first person to compare a sitting world champion to Sauron. You'd be wrong. This is from Child of Change, which Kasparov wrote in 1987, and he's talking about Karpov. In the USSR, there's a fairy tale monster called Koshchei Immortal. I've also seen it spelled Koshchei the Deathless, but anyway, who hides deep in his kingdom and sends out his emissaries to kill off all invaders. If this fails, he sends out more, then more again, waves and waves of protectors. Only as a very last resort, when his kingdom is seriously at risk, does Koshchei deign to come down from his castle and fight the intruder himself. It is like the mythical Black Rider sent by Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. The hero has to go through many fights before he meets the super creature of extraordinary strength. Only by winning one victory after another can he face that battle and still hope to stand. Had the forces hit him straight away at the beginning of his journey, he would surely have lost, no matter how fanatical or worthy his cause. This is the irony I will never understand. The very trials and tribulations create a strength that was not there at the beginning. I knew by now that I had entered his homeland. I didn't know the rules of combat there, and I wasn't going to be the one who fired the first shot. I had felt the brute force of my enemy's power, but I had yet to see his face. A confrontation could not be long delayed. Now, the hero, as you might guess, in Kasparov's narrative is Kasparov, and the villain is Karpov. Now, I don't actually agree with Kasparov's view. I'll bring up a couple of reasons why. First, Kasparov and Karpov have known each other since their simul game in 1975, and certainly Karpov would have recognized Garry's talent going back to probably 1978 when he, burst on the international scene. But they played together in the 1980 Olympiad. This is not very well known. And there was an instance in one of Kasparov's games where his opponent, a GM by the name of Georgiev, had touched a piece and then moved another piece. And Garry tried to invoke the touch move rule. Karpov, who was sitting at a nearby table, claimed that he had witnessed it and supported Garry's claim. However, he wasn't considered a neutral observer. There was no neutral observer. So an arbiter came over and said, there is no instance of touch move. The claim is overturned. Continue play. But Karpov supported him there. Garry lost that match. And the Soviet trainer, a GM by the name of Baterinsky, was going to sit him in the subsequent round, but Karpov said, let him play. And he did, and he won. And Karpov was justified in that decision because Garry in the 1980 Olympiad was, I think, tied with Karpov as top scorer and helped them win that particular Olympiad. So that was the first instance where I think Karpov was actually quite the gentleman and overlooked an instance where he could have, tried to mess with Kasparov's head. I think it was more the Soviet chess establishment that was really trying to keep Kasparov down, and Karpov just kind of went along with it. There's plenty of times where Karpov just kind of goes along with things, and I think that may have been one of them. I showed this slide in the last presentation on Karpov, and I just reversed it this time to show Kasparov's record against Karpov so that you can see just how very close their rivalry was. Again, for that whole series of 144 matches, Kasparov had 2 more wins than Karpov, so very, very close. They had an intense rivalry, certainly in chess, but that rivalry also extended to politics. And I'll give you an example. Karpov was a member of the Soviet establishment, not just chess establishment, but also the political establishment. He was a card-carrying communist because you had to actually elect to join the Communist Party when you reached majority age. Now, Garry Kasparov reached majority age actually right before he turned 21, he applied and was accepted, this is February 28th, 1983, to become a member of the Communist Party. Now, did Garry share communist political ideals? I don't actually believe that he did, although his maternal grandfather certainly advocated them and maybe tried to instill them in Garry, but they had very heated debates about these sorts of things. But I think that his chess career was certainly facilitated by becoming a communist, and to kind of level the ideological playing field between him and Karpov. I think this is the second instance where Garry kind of compromises who he was to further his chess career, and he may disagree on that. He may have actually espoused that ideology, and if he did, then I apologize. But we'll see in the 1990s. He certainly falls out of favor, or he certainly falls out of love with communism, if he ever was in love. So if Karpov was not the villain of our story, who is the real villain? Well, I think Kasparov would agree, because he talks about him a lot, it would be FIDE President Florencio Campomanes. Now, in his book Child of Change, written in 1987, when Campomanes is still president of FIDE, Kasparov pulls no punches. And it reminds me, and this is a play on an Eminem song title, because Kasparov in his book kind of reminds me of a rap artist when he just is talking about something completely different, and then he comes back and rants about Campomanes, and then he's talking about something else, and he figures a way to rant about Karpov and Campomanes again. So he just keeps coming. It's kind of a idée fixe. It's kind of a fixed idea that Kasparov is just going to go off on Campomanes. But to understand Campomanes' role, I need to give you a little bit of backstory about him. So Campomanes, let's go back to 1982. The current FIDE president is Fredrik Olafsson of Iceland, and he's campaigning for re-election. His chief rival is Florencio Campomanes from the Philippines. Now, Campomanes, to give you some of his backstory, is a chess player himself and was the captain of the Philippines' 1956 Olympiad team, and he participated on several other Olympiad teams, but Kasparov doesn't think much of his chess ability, thinks a lot of his political ability, but not much of his chess ability, because what he really had was connection. He had the support of the Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and he helped secure the $5 million prize purse, which was going to be offered to Fischer and Karpov to play in 1975. That match never materialized. So instead, the Philippines hosted the 1978 World Championship between Korchnoi and Karpov. Campomanes was the principal organizer of that, securing the prize fund from Ferdinand Marcos. So he was an organizer in FIDE, and he was certainly well connected politically. But his win was almost a fluke, because Olafsson was well liked. He was well liked by the players. He was considered someone who had kind of followed in the footsteps of Max Owa, someone who was objective and put the players' interests, equal or above interests of other parties. Campomanes, not so much, but the reason that Campomanes won is because the Soviet Federation supported Campomanes. Why? Because Olafsson supported or had lobbied the USSR to release Korchnoi's family. Remember, they were still kind of under house arrest in the Soviet Union, and they'd been separated now for almost 6 years. And Olafsson had tried to convince the Soviets, privately and publicly, to let Korchnoi's family rejoin him in Switzerland. And because of this, the Soviets, through their support behind Florencio Campomanes, and the support of all the neighboring states, because they kind of followed the Soviet Union, and this would come back to bite the Soviet Union later on. So 1983, it's the candidates tournament, the semifinals. You have Smyslov, who's in his 60s, but has won his way through to face Ribley. And the other semifinal is going to pit Kasparov versus Korchnoi. Now, you'll know that when they're hosting matches like this, they accept bids. So several different cities bid, and then the candidates express their preference for which city they'd like to play in. And then FIDE is supposed to take that into consideration and choose a site that would make both players happy. So for the Kasparov-Korchnoi bid, there are 3 cities that bid. The first choice of Korchnoi is Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The second choice of Kasparov is Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And Florencio Campomanes unilaterally decides that the match is going to be held in Pasadena, California, which is a city that neither player selected. Now, why did he choose Pasadena? Who knows? Maybe because Bobby Fischer was supposedly living there and he wanted to try to tempt him back into chess. I don't know. It's speculation. And Smyslov's semifinal was to be played in Abu Dhabi. Now, the Soviet Federation was livid because the United States had boycotted participation in the Olympics in 1980, and the Soviets had pretty much planned to boycott the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, and Pasadena is kind of close to Los Angeles. And so the Soviet Federation forbid Kasparov from participating and forbid Smyslov from participating, and was going to try to use that pressure to force FIDE, Florencio Campomanes essentially, to reconsider. But he did. And so Korchnoi showed up in Pasadena, played 1d4, waited an hour, and the match was that game, and then the match was considered forfeit in his favor. Same thing happened in Abu Dhabi. Smyslov didn't show up. Match was considered forfeited for Ribley, and it was a big black mark on the Soviets. So Kasparov calls Gaidar Aliyev and says, "Hey, I need some help." And Aliyev puts him in touch with the propaganda minister of the Soviet Union at the time. I can't remember his name. And the propaganda minister says, "No, this can't be. These matches have to happen." So essentially, Kasparov works out a gentleman's agreement with Korchnoi. Korchnoi agrees to play Kasparov and to not forfeit the title. And Ribley agrees similarly to play Smyslov. And they both agree to play their semifinals. They all 4 agree to play their semifinals in London. As reparations, the Soviet Union has to pay $160,000 to FIDE. Part of that money goes to Pasadena because of their expense. Part of that money goes to FIDE itself, which goes into Campomanes' slush fund, and nobody really knows where that money ends up. And the semifinals end up occurring in London. Smyslov wins his semifinal. Kasparov wins his semifinal. Both of them win fairly readily, although at the beginning of the match, Kasparov had some nerves that he had to kind of work out, but then he brought it home pretty strongly. Now, I want you to remember, for the purposes of this lecture, this unilateral action taken by Campomanes, because it's not the last time. So, the 1984 World Championship starts in September 1984 in Moscow, and it ends in February 1985 when FIDE President Florencio Campomanes calls it without decision. I've got the match record there for you below. You'll recall from the Karpov lecture that Karpov jumped to a very early lead. He was up 4-0 after 9 games, and then he wins game 27 after 17 successive draws, which was a FIDE record, to go up 5-0. And the thought is that Karpov was trying to 6-0 Kasparov. That's what Kasparov claims. He claims he's trying to 6-0 him, kind of like what Bobby Fischer did to Bent Larsen and to Mark Taimanov. And Kasparov suspects the reason that Karpov is trying to do this is because after Fischer shellacked Taimanov 6-0, Taimanov's career was pretty much over. And he lost his stipend, he didn't participate in international tournaments for a couple of years, and he never reached the same standing that he had during that candidate cycle. And Kasparov suspects that Karpov wanted to beat him by a similar margin to do similar damage to Kasparov's career. And so he played it safe. Kasparov said if he would have just tried to win, maybe he would have lost a few, but he would have won the match because, eventually one of his attacks would have succeeded. But that's not the way Karpov played. He played very safe. And this allowed Kasparov to grow and develop over the course of the match. Kasparov improved dramatically over the course of this match. First, he got over his nerves. Second, he actually got a lot better at opening prep. And third, he figured out Karpov's style a lot better, and he settled down, and he was doing quite well. So what happens is Kasparov actually wins his first game, game 32, and game 27 was actually the last game that Karpov won. That was 3 months before the end. So the momentum clearly shifted to Kasparov, and even though there were quite a few draws, don't get me wrong, Kasparov had momentum, and by the time the match was called, Kasparov had just won games 47 and 48. Now, I say just won. That's true in terms of the match, but it's not true chronologically because between games in 47 and 48, there's almost like a 2-week timeout that Karpov had called and that Campomanes called, and then anyway. So Campomanes intervenes and he calls the match without decision. And this was in direct violation of the contract, which says quite clearly the player who wins 6 games, not counting drawn games, becomes world champion. The number of games is unlimited. Campomanes calls a press conference February 15th, 1985, and says, I'm empowered to make the final decision. I declare that the match is ended without decision, acting unilaterally again. Now, this press conference was quite contentious. And Karpov spoke at it and said he still wanted to play. Kasparov spoke at it and said he still wanted to play. Campomanes said, well, let's go back to the stage because we haven't had a chance to all discuss this, and let's discuss it for 10 minutes. A couple hours later, Campomanes comes back out and says the match is called. Karpov supports my decision, and Kasparov will abide by my decision. Clear wording there. And we will resume this match in September with a score of 0-0. Now, there's talk that Karpov was worn out and that psychologically he couldn't go on, physically he couldn't go on. I don't know how true that is. Kasparov thinks that claim has a lot of merit. Kasparov certainly could have gone on, and anytime he had a chance to tell a journalist, he said, I feel great, I want to keep playing. But Campomanes called it for the first and only time in chess history. I can't think of any other time. Hasn't happened since that a match has been called like this. And it also hasn't happened since that a match has been designated as unlimited games, right? 1985, as I mentioned, the return match occurs in September 1985. This time it's limited to best of 24. Going into the tournament, or the match, Kasparov and Karpov have a very close rating. And Kasparov starts the match exactly where he left off. He wins game 1. However, it goes back and forth and back and forth. And there were a lot of beautiful games in this match, but it turned out that Kasparov won. And we're going to shortly see probably the best game from this series. But I want to tell you about a funny event that happened on game 19. You see Kasparov had the white pieces and he won. They reached the time control. And so the typical procedure when the game was not decided is that the player whose turn it was to move would write down their move on a sheet of paper, put it in an envelope, and hand it to the arbiter. This is sealing a move. And then the opponent would not know what move that was going to be. They could prepare for a couple of eventualities, obviously. They'd adjourn the game. They'd come back to the game the next day or a couple days later, depended. And the arbiter would open the envelope in front of everyone and play the move that had been sealed, and the match would continue. Now, we don't play with adjournments anymore because computers completely nullify the point. So nowadays there aren't any adjournments, but at the time they adjourned quite frequently, and the sealed move was a procedure. But in game 19, Kasparov was up, and feeling quite cocky, he writes down his move on a slip of paper, puts it in the envelope, hands it to the arbiter, and then plays it on the board. Yeah. He trolled Karpov, by playing the move with, you know, and in front of him saying, what now? You know, what are you going to do about it? Well, what Karpov did was he resigned the game by phone without even showing up after the adjournment. So Kasparov wins the match, wins that game, and he wins the match. And everybody was quite happy. Smyslov said, "This is the end of Tolya's era!" Exclamation point. Rhoda Petrosian, Tigran unfortunately has died by this point, says, quote, "It's a victory for justice." And Kasparov says, "When I got back to our palace, as we called it, I went through room after room for 15 minutes, just screaming and yelling out of pure animal joy." So Kasparov wins the match. It was a fairly close match. Obviously, going into the last game, Kasparov is up 1 point, so Karpov is playing for a win, and Kasparov turns it into a win of zone and further extends the score. But it was full of some very good chess, and despite Kasparov's proclamations that he was, you know, a much stronger player, it was really, really close. But let's see some of Kasparov's brilliance by looking at a game, probably the best game, like I mentioned, from the 1985 World Championship, and then we'll look at a position from the 1986 World Championship. And again, I will defer to Warren for that.
Yeah, these Kasparov-Karpov World Championship matches were really some of the best. I mean, you see some really cool games, and it's you could almost dedicate, you know, an entire lecture to just one World Championship match, you know, and especially the 1984 one, you could probably dedicate several lectures to that many games. But the following game is probably my favorite Kasparov game. It's such his style, and it's really inspiring kind of game. And so let's just get started and show you what happened. So although later in his career, Kasparov became, you know, notorious for his skill in the Najdorf, at that time this was an opening he liked, the Taimanov, right? And Karpov, as you know, as opposed to the regular knight c3, he preferred this more positional idea, trying to maintain a bind on the d5 square. So the setup was pawns on c4 and e4. It's a Maroczy bind generally, right? So this is definitely the style of Karpov, and of course, if you know anything about Kasparov, he doesn't like this kind of slow, protracted maneuvering, right? So he devised a way in this opening, though, to make it more interesting. So we'll see what he does. He plays this interesting pawn sacrifice, d5. And they'd actually had a game previous in this match with this opening. So this was not a surprise for Karpov. Okay. But he didn't see Kasparov's preparation. So here he was expecting Kasparov to take on d5, and with either knight it leads to a slightly better endgame for white. And of course he was happy with this. With white he can just milk a little bit of an advantage. But Kasparov had a surprise for him. He played bishop c5. And according to Kasparov, Karpov immediately was kind of upset, I guess, because he didn't look at this at all. So he wasn't really sure what to do. Now, as interesting as bishop c5 is, it's not really such a great move. Now, white doesn't have a reputation, but white has a really strong move here. Does anybody know it? I mean, for not without good reason, this line is not really so popular now for black. Now, white can play bishop e3. And this is a problem for black because after bishop takes e3, white has queen a4. And after, say, knight d7, queen b4, black has to either trade queens, go into an endgame of pawn down, or play the awkward king f8. And in either event, white has great winning chances, right? So, you know, if Kasparov is kind of grandiose here. He writes, if Karpov had found this, and the match would have turned out differently. But and he uses a capital F. Fate decreed otherwise. But as we'll see, Karpov didn't see a critical moment, so he just quickly castled. Yeah, which makes sense. But after Kasparov castles, now the moment for bishop e3 is kind of past because you can't pick up that knight with queen a4. Now bishop e3 would be silly because black would just take and take on d4. So now he has to defend d5 and bishop f5. Now, I should also mention that Kasparov had already done some preparation of this line. In fact, I'll tell you the exact position that he says he had on his pocket, chessboard later on. But one of his ideas here is to support this d3 square. And he wanted to put a knight there to block off white's communication with the d-pawn and also just dominate with that knight. I mean, oftentimes a knight on d3 for black or for white, the d6 square is called like an octopus. Right, that's what you might call that knight, right? Tentacles, 8, So that's what he was going for. And now this move is just really strong because if it were white's move here, he could play knight c4. I'll just mention quickly that white wouldn't play knight c4 here because of bishop d3, right? Hitting the knight and the rook. So that's why he played queen d2, because now he's prepared to play, for example, rook fe1, knight c4, getting his pieces into play. So b5 stops that. And now knight d3 creates an immediate problem for white. b4 is already threatened. Now white can try to evict the knight immediately with bishop e2, but this doesn't work. How can black play? Black can win material here. b4 isn't good enough because white will take the knight.
Can you just take the bishop with the rook?
If rook takes e2, knight takes e2.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, can he take the b pawn with the knight?
If
And then bring the bishop in?
if knight takes b2, then queen takes b2.
Oh,
Knight takes f2.
Yeah, knight takes f2 is the reason.
Oh.
White has little choice because they discovered check to take it, and now b4.
And you get the rook.
Exactly. So black ends up the exchange. Yep. So from here on out, it's amazing how concrete Kasparov is, just strangling white little by little, and really giving white hardly any room to improve. Now, this was probably Karpov's last good chance to really try to equalize with knight e2, trying somehow to extricate this knight with knight c1. But later on, he loses this possibility. Instead, he played knight b1, visibly it's kind of disgusting. He hardly had much other choice because of knight c2, you lose b2.
Yeah,
So
then
it's
you can take.
yeah, it's difficult to offer much advice. So unfortunately, he has to be passive. Now h6, checking the bishop. Now white always has to think about this nasty possible idea of g5, g4, and the bishop may not have much room to maneuver. So white's constantly got to be worrying about that. So black plays b4, pushing the knight away to the edge. Now bishop parks in front of that white d-pawn, preventing white from freeing this bishop. So it's going to remain just a little more than a pawn. And with this move, he's restricting the movement of the white queen, right? And now white's getting ready to untangle. It looks like he might be out of this. If he has time, the next move, he's going to play knight b2.
Oh, I see.
And that, well, mainly just trying to get rid of this knight. And if he can get rid of that black knight on d3, then his position will be a lot more free. So even though Kasparov's position is great, if he allows white to play knight b2, it's hard to say if he's even better. So here he finds that it was just such a great move. Some of you who have already seen this game probably know it, but
Stop that then.
so your goal is to stop knight b2.
So, bishop e5.
What's that?
Bishop e5. To stop.
Bishop e5?
Oh, sorry. I was saying, to stop the knight to go.
Here?
You just take it.
Oh,
Sorry,
oh,
I'm sorry,
black.
I'm sorry.
Black?
I'm sorry.
Well, bishop e5 then
Oh, yeah,
takes.
he just takes, yeah.
Yeah.
Can you go to the rook to c2?
Well, rook c2, I think white can just take it.
Just take, right?
Yeah, there's no check to.
Yeah, there's no check to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, any discovery doesn't work anyways because the bishop hangs.
Queen a5.
Queen a5?
Yeah, with the idea of attacking a2, hopefully.
Okay, so if knight b2, you want to think about taking on a2?
I would do. If not,
Well, oh, actually, it just hangs a bishop, right?
Well, the bishop
Oh.
is.
Didn't notice that. Yeah, yeah, that took me a long time to notice. Yeah. You want to see the magic, or do you want me to give you a little more time?
maybe a hint.
Go ahead, we give up.
Okay, so I'll give you another minute or so. Okay, so your goal is to stop knight b2. Now, which one of white's pieces has very little scope? Knight on a4, yes, but you can't really win it. Knight on b1 the same way.
The queen can't really go anywhere.
Yeah, the queen is basically stalemated. That's important to notice. Now, what other white piece can't really move?
Bishop on f3.
Bishop on f3 has a very limited scope. So is there any way we can try to disturb that bishop's residence? Exactly. That's exactly what he played. Now, it may not be apparently clear why playing g4 might be helpful, but knight b2 becomes now impossible because of knight takes b2 and g4.
And the bishop is stuck.
And he's stuck because of bishop b2, rook c2 wins the bishop. So by playing g5, he prevents knight b2. So that knight remains stuck on the rim. And of course, all the saying about that, right? And, amazingly, despite being the middle game, white hardly even has moves. I mean, it's almost Zugzwang in the middle game with all the minor pieces and rooks on the board. I mean, it's pretty amazing you would see that, much less in a world championship game. So, I mean, it's just amazing to win
It feels
this.
like you still got a bunch of pieces on the board and you're opening up your king too, to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, and g5, generally speaking, is just unintuitive because you're just creating a weakness in your king. It just, I mean, when I first look at the position anyway, I don't first think, oh, g5, obviously.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a very, very concrete mind to think of that move. I mean, if you just dedicate yourself thinking, okay, I've got to stop knight b2 at all costs, then maybe you might think of it. But still, it's a hard move to consider. But yeah, the impression this game makes is it's pretty amazing. So white decided to get rid of at least one piece, help himself out a little bit. And now he has room for his bishop, so at least he's not going to perish, right? But unfortunately, despite not losing material, white still doesn't have much room to move his pieces. So now black's bringing his knight around to a more active post on e5. Now, another interesting point is that knight b2 still doesn't work. You guys see what black can play? It's amazing how clever Kasparov is here.
He can take the knight and move the rook down to c2.
He can, but then the white queen would go to d4. For example, if knight takes, rook c2. I mean, black is still doing well, but white can hold on. Kasparov had a very clever idea in mind.
How about the knight on 7 to e5?
That is a good move.
You attack that bishop.
3.
Yeah, that is a good move, but black has even better.
Knight on 3 to e5.
Knight on 3 e5?
Yeah.
He's not retreating.
No, you don't want to move that knight. It's too valuable.
So his idea is to play rook c2.
And you got the queen.
Oh, you mean even before taking the knight?
double threat queen fork, right?
Yeah, but I think white must be able to save this. I'm not sure how, though.
I see the double attack on
It does look difficult, though. I can only imagine that he was intending on playing queen e3. Yeah, it looks like this is actually okay. Black actually has even better here.
Well, I see no shame in admitting I'm not as clever as Kasparov.
All right, so he decided that he was going to play queen f6. And if white tries to get rid of that knight, then white's queen is trapped.
Wow. And the bishop isn't doing well either.
Yeah, in the middle of the board, the queen has nowhere safe to go.
It's forked everywhere.
Yeah, pretty cute line. Yeah. That's a move that I don't think I would see in a game. But yeah, it's apparent that maybe other moves besides queen f6 won, but that was why Karpov dismissed knight b2, and that was what Kasparov was intending as well. So he safeguarded the bishop, and now queen f6 anyway, so still preventing white from getting that knight out. So black still is just dominating. So white's trying to at least trade something to get a square for his queen. Now at least he can go to a2. It's not very very heartening, but at least it's not losing. Now he wanted to have access to this f3 square. The queen just wandering around headless. It's kind of sad. Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to suggest anything for white at this point. f3 just pretty much loses, but it's hard to even say how he can improve his position. I mean, his knight's stuck. His knight at a4 is not doing anything. Can't move your bishop anywhere. I mean, it's amazing that you see a world champion in this kind of knot, but now black brings this knight around.
Why didn't he take the pawn before, by the way? The pawn
back.
b4, is it just he's leaving his king open or something? Back, one more. When you moved the pawn to f3, why didn't he take, the pawn with the knight, the knight, sorry.
Yeah, the pawn's guarded by the knight. Yeah, so now all of Kasparov's pieces are coming into the game. Knight e4 is just deadly, right? If white parts with the bishop, then it's almost made, and otherwise knight f2 comes. So he has to give up an exchange, but it doesn't help. Yeah, Kasparov makes a point here. He thinks it's nice and symbolic that white has to take the knight with the queen, because the knight was so dominant throughout the game that white had to give up his queen for that piece. You know, it's pretty amazing. And here he just mops up. You know, the weakness of the back rank is really telling. Yeah, this is a nice move, right? Takes, then takes, and white has 3 pieces, but this is dying. This is dying.
The knight isn't doing too well either.
Yeah, and he still has this possible passer over here. So knight b2. Now the knight's doing something, I guess, but it's too late. And then finally he resigned, right? It's checkmate, right? Knight f1 takes and queen takes. Mate, right? Yeah, so this is my favorite Kasparov game. I mean, it's one of the rare games I've ever seen where there's every piece is on the board, but the side is almost in Zugzwang. I mean, that's amazing. And Kasparov was able to do this not against a weak opponent, but Karpov. So I think it's a pretty cool game. Any questions about that one? It was pretty sharp. No? All right.
So Kasparov won that match, the game and the match, and not necessarily he didn't stop Karpov. He never succeeded in just blowing Karpov off the board, but he did win convincingly. And I should tell you, incidentally, that from a tournament in Tilburg in 1981 till Linares in 1991, Kasparov entered quite a few tournaments and won or tied for first in all of them. He did not lose a tournament for almost 10 years, and I think that in 1991 he finished his streak was ended when he finished second to a young Vasily Ivanchuk, of all people. Fischer, you may recall, after he won the World Championship, he'd never played another tournament again. Kasparov said that he was going to be an active champion, and he was not only going to play tournaments, he was also going to play matches. And so he traveled around, sponsored by various organizations, and played various grandmasters who were quite strong. And he kind of exerted his will. One of the people that he played was Grandmaster Anthony Miles, or Tony Miles. This was in May 1986. And Kasparov destroyed him. Tony Miles thought that he was playing some sort of monster. And now Kasparov was a pretty intimidating guy. People talk about his energy over the board and how he was very intimidating and how it just seemed like he was burning with chess fever. And I'm reminded from his stare of a young Misha Tal. I think Tal still had perhaps the better stare. I don't know if anybody had a stare more disconcerting than Tal, but Kasparov certainly was up there and probably remains up there for the vehemence of his stare. You'll recall that the 1985 World Championship was played about 6 months after the 1984 championship was annulled. And in the contract, Karpov secured the right of a return match should he lose. And he lost and exercised that right. And so they played again in 1986. Originally, this was supposed to be scheduled for February 10th, 1986, which was about 4 or 5 months after the 85 championship concluded. And Kasparov said, wait a second, hold your horses. We've just played, and the candidate cycle has always been at least a year, if not 3 years, and now you're going to make it 4 months? That's not fair. And so he and Karpov said, you know what? We should take FIDE out of the equation, and we should agree to our own terms. And so they both agreed that they were going to play in the summer of 1986, and they basically said, deal with it, FIDE. And so Florencio Campomanes backed off of his threat to cancel or annul Kasparov's World Championship and declare Karpov the champion, blah, blah, blah. And they played again. Yeah, it got that bad. And they played again in 1986 in London. There's Kasparov and Karpov with Margaret Thatcher. This time, it started in July, and the arbiter of the match was Lothar Schmidt, who you may recall was the arbiter in the 1972 Fischer versus Spassky match. He was a very well-respected West German GM, considered objective and fair, stern but fair. And Kasparov definitely didn't want the same arbiter who had been present for the 84 world champion. That was Gligorich, of all people. Didn't want him because he had been involved in the Campomanes fiasco. So Schmid was the arbiter. Did a good job. They played in 1986. Again, it was very close, but with a win in Game 22, Kasparov was able to seal the match. And incidentally, I want to point out this was the first World Championship to be played with electronic pieces. Computer chess had come a long way, and they actually put little coils, circuits, in the pieces so that when moves were made, it updated the demo boards in real time. And so not only were the audience able to more closely follow the match, but also people outside who couldn't come into the venue were able to watch, and it was actually broadcast on television almost in real time. This was 1986. I mean, nowadays we have streaming tournaments, and that's great, but the genesis of that goes all the way back to 1986. Incidentally, I also want to point out about this match that this was right after the Chernobyl disaster, the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl, and both players agreed to donate 100% of their earnings for this match to the victims of the Chernobyl disaster. So it was a really nice gesture on both of their parts, and not going to be the last time that we're going to see Kasparov make a humanitarian gesture like that. We do have a position from game 22 of this match. Do you want to show that real quick right now, Lauren?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead and show that position. This is game 22, kind of the conclusive or deciding game of that match.
Yeah, Kasparov was, he's known for his middle game play, I would say, but he was also not so bad in the end game, and he played a sharp end game, okay, and he comes up with a really cool move here before the adjournment, and he came up with Knight D7.
Yes, this was a sealed move.
Yeah, he played this before the adjournment, and according to Kasparov, Karpov back in this position was rather content because it's hard to say exactly what white can do, because if you take on G6, then black is going to have good drawing chances. This is a really hard game to win. Exactly. So this is almost certainly draw. Well, maybe white can try something, but Karpov is not bad at endgames himself. He'll probably be able to draw that, right? So Karpov apparently was pretty content thinking that's what Kasparov would do. But instead he sealed this move Knight D7. And according to Kasparov, when he arrived at the board, Karpov looked completely different. He thought that Karpov had seen this in his analysis and was worried that it was actually the move sealed. And when the move Knight D7 was actually played, he said Karpov just visibly kind of sunk, kind of thinking he was lost.
Kasparov was somewhat stingy in his double exclams, but I believe he gave himself a double exclam for this move.
Yeah, that's an important point to make too. You know, he's you'll see a lot of exclams in his analysis, but double, he regards those for only very special locations. And it's for this one, it's just amazing because of how deep it is.
What did Black move next?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. So the idea is he's trying to get this knight into f8, and if Black's king goes backwards, then so will the rook, and he's got a mating net going. So the king is going to have to come up. But as you'll see, that has a problem in itself, because now if the white queen is able to deliver check on this diagonal, then it's going to be mate. And this theme really causes problems for Karpov. Okay, and here he plays a really cool move, rook b4. So this move is just amazing. So the first point is that if Black tries to trade rooks and go into an endgame, it doesn't work. This really fun sequence happens. Even though Black queen's first, White's threatening mate on f4. But if Black guards it with, say, like queen c1, then knight takes. Of course, this is checkmate. And if you play queen takes, then White mates anyway. This really sick checkmate. I mean, it's not very often you'll see a double queen ending like this. I mean, and the fact that Kasparov, saw this after knight d7 is just amazing. I mean, that's a pretty cool sequence. It's not something you see very often. So even though Black queen's first, that ending is helpless because of the cage that his king is stuck in. So Karpov can't trade rooks, and other moves fail. So he played rook c4, and you'll see why that fails in a minute. But even if he had tried a move like rook d3, this doesn't really help him either. And White has this really cool move in queen e1.
Oh.
So this another backwards move is really hard to see. So we're threatening queen c1 and mates, right? Now Black can defend this, at least temporarily, by queen c8. But now Kasparov can play this really cool move, queen e5. Now, queen f8 doesn't work because of rook b8. And rook h8 is mate as well. Okay? So knight's immune, but Black can come back. But White wins anyway with queen g3. It's really weird triangulation going on. Okay? Now the point is that if rook takes a3, then White has rook d4. Threatening rook takes d5, followed by queen f4. Now if Black plays rook a5, White has this beautiful finishing stroke here. See if you can find it. Yeah, the move he gives is queen c7. Threatening the rook and
mate also.
And queen c1, yeah. And if Black guards it with like rook a1, then just rook d5. Yeah. Huh. So he played rook c4, but he just takes and plays queen d6. So he's threatening queen d2 check, right? So c3, but now queen d4, threatening queen e3 and the pawn. So Black has pretty much no defense here. I mean, he can play bishop h7, but then simply takes. And then Black's king is still stuck. White's just threatening queen e3 followed by trading. And he has this extra a pawn over here. Exactly. So yeah, pretty cool ending. It just looks like a regular pawn-up ending, maybe tough to grind out, and then Kasparov just goes on full attack mode. So pretty cool. Any questions about this? All right.
Okay, so Kasparov retains his title in 1986, and he's going to, and now we run into the normal candidate cycle. He's going to have to defend it again in 1987, and it's going to be, spoiler alert, Karpov again. But before that, I wanted to talk a little bit about Kasparov's involvement in computing and chess with computing. In 1985, Christmas 1985, Kasparov spends Christmas at the home of Frederick Friedel, a German computer scientist, and incidentally one of the co-founders of ChessBase. Now, many of us in this room and many people watching at home probably have ChessBase installed on their first computer or on their computer, and they may use it for games. You may not know that the licensing number that you get for ChessBase, the person who got license number 1 was Garry Kasparov. And Kasparov visited Friedel, and he wanted Friedel to create a database program that he could use to look at the games of his opponents. Now, at the time, you needed a team of seconds, and they might spend days or even weeks tracking down games for you of your opponents to help you prepare to play them. And Kasparov wisely pointed out that a computer would be well suited to create a database. And we know from those of us who have PGN files on our computer, they're tiny. We're talking 400, 500 bytes. So we're not even talking about, there's no memory issue involved. So a lot of the early limitations of computers, like hard drive space, or even processing power, that wasn't really an issue for a database with tiny, tiny files. And so it turned out ChessBase became one of the first software programs, for chess, and Kasparov from 1985 onward, tried to incorporate computers into his preparation. And incidentally, in 1987, he said, no computer can ever beat me. He also said in his 1987 book, Child of Change, that that no woman can ever beat a world champion. And let's just be glad that Garry stuck to chess and not working as a psychic or a prophet, because he was, as we'll see in our part 2 of the lecture, he was wrong on both counts. So in 1986, Kasparov started an interesting initiative. He worked with other grandmasters and to create a grandmasters association. And the reason is quite simple. He went before the FIDE Congress in Dubai and basically slapped him in the face by saying, you don't care about chess and your decisions are dumb, and we're going to create an organization that can better represent the interests of chess players. And so he, along with Nigel Short, Jan Tinman, Anatoly Karpov, and many, many others, created the Grandmasters Association. Initial officers, Garry was president, Karpov and Tinman were vice presidents. Founding members also include Yubojevic, Pornish, Sirawan, yes, or Sirawan, interesting, John Nunn, and the financial sponsor, a guy by the name of Bessel Koch, K-O-K, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. In May 1987, most of the Soviet GMs threw their support behind it and decided to join it as well. And this took away some power from FIDE, and it also took power away from the Soviet Chess Federation. Now, the Grandmasters Association was somewhat short-lived. It kind of collapsed in 1990, but it had some interesting impacts. First, the Grandmasters proposed a change in the time controls. They proposed, instead of playing 5 hours and then adjourning, playing 6 hours and adjourning. So the time control that we currently see in tournaments, where you have 2.5 hours for the first 40 moves, that was the old system. Now it's like 2 hours for the first 40 moves, followed by an hour per person for the next 20 moves, and then an adjournment if it's not finished. So this meant that far fewer games were adjourned. One interesting impact. I guess you could say it also favored the younger players because it was more about endurance. I'm not entirely sure about that. But it certainly helped the transition to the computer era, when adjournments basically became inexistent, because anybody could use an adjournment to look at 30 or 40 plies of a computer engine evaluation. And they also set up a World Cup system comprised of several small tournaments with the top grandmasters, and with grandmasters sitting out of certain tournaments, so they all play 4 out of 6, and then the person with the most points at the end wins. And this is very similar to the Grand Prix system, which still exists today. So they were the founders of that system, and the Grand Prix system was designed to be somewhat of a competition or a supplement, if you will, to the organized tournaments that FIDE did. And so the Grandmasters Association had quite a bit of clout, and they became I don't want to say rivals with FIDE, but they certainly gave the players far more leverage. And in December 1989, the Grandmasters Association started taking action to organize the World Championships, which previously was the purview of FIDE. And the Grandmasters Association, unfortunately, didn't work out for reasons I'll get into a little later. So 1987, Karpov actually had to qualify for the World Chess Championship, which he did by defeating Sokolov in the candidates final +4 -0 = 7, so handily. And in this particular tournament, or this particular match, excuse me, you'll note that the series was actually drawn 12-12. As usual, when the series is drawn, the current champion retains his title, as Kasparov did. You'll also note that Kasparov had to win the last game to retain his title. If Karpov had succeeded in drawing the last game, and most of their games ended in draws, it would have been a win in the match for Karpov. But Kasparov came in with a very interesting strategy. He basically copied Karpov's style, played very slowly, played very positionally, played very patiently, waited for Karpov to make little mistakes and accumulated, small advantages, and then capitalized on it and won to retain his title in a drawn match. Of course, he split the prize pool, but if you're Kasparov, you don't care about the prize pool, you care about the title. So this was certainly the closest match they ever played, and their next to last match, as we'll see. Now, I've mentioned that Kasparov was very successful in tournaments. I've mentioned that he played frequently. It's interesting to look at the type of tournaments he played in and the type of results he had, and it's interesting to see how his ELO progressed when you compare it against, say, Bobby Fischer, which was certainly Kasparov's goal, was to surpass Bobby Fischer, which he achieved in September of 1989 by breaking the 2800 barrier. And this right-hand column, I actually took this from Magnus Carlsen's website, where he's compared his ELO rating to Carlsen. And what he's done in this right column is he's converted the ELO rating into 2014 levels. It's a big area of contention whether or not ELO has inflated over time, but most experts agree that it has, and Carlsen even outright says, by including a column inflating the rating to show how it would compare to today's ratings, showing that Kasparov actually has the highest rating at 2880 in history. Now, he never reached that in his actual career. He capped out at, I think, 2820 or 2830. And
2851.
2851, thank you. In 1999, was it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we'll get to that in part two. But in today's terms, that is much higher than 2851. And I said at the beginning of the lecture I was going to make a case for why Kasparov might be the best chess player of all time. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is because from essentially 1983 to 2003, he was the #1 rated player in the world. There were a couple times where a couple people tied him. Kramnik tied him a time or two. Karpov tied him once, but Kasparov was at the top of the ELO ratings for a long, long time. So Kasparov is doing very well. He's kicking lots of butt. And then that geopolitical conflict that I mentioned earlier bears its ugly head. In January of 1990, called Black January, there was an ethnic tension that boiled over into pogroms, essentially, against ethnic Armenians in the city of Baku and in the country of Azerbaijan. Why? Because of the Nagorno-Karabakh region that I talked about at the very beginning. Remember Gaidar Aliyev, the Kasparov's buddy and the former president of the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan? Well, he was in the Politburo, and he and Gorbachev had a falling out, and Aliyev was kind of removed from the Politburo, and as a result, supposedly he went to the Karabakh region and kind of stirred up dissent and convinced the ethnic Armenians there to push for independence, or at least push for their departure from the Soviet Union, or departure from Azerbaijan, and their participation in Armenia or joining Armenia. And it makes sense, they're surrounded geographically by Armenia, and they're ethnic Armenians, but the Azerbaijanis are very attached to that region. And so when that dissent started occurring, the Azerbaijanis reacted by persecuting the Armenians in Baku and in other places in Azerbaijan, and this was a very dark time in Azerbaijan. One of the reasons is the Soviet military was very late in intervening to stop this ethnic violence, probably because Gorbachev and Aliyev had their little spat. But the result was hundreds of people died. There was mass looting, destruction of property, rapes, you name it, it was bad. I actually have an acquaintance through work who was 4 years Kasparov's junior and lived in Baku during the time. And she said even today, you know, they still don't talk about it. It was that bad. But essentially, if you were Armenian, you either left or you were killed. And so they say Black Saturday was January 13th, 1990. Kasparov evacuated in January 17th, 1990, and he left Baku, and he has probably returned since, but he essentially had to abandon everything that he knew, everything that he had, his friends, his acquaintances, and he, like thousands of other Azerbaijanis of Armenian descent, had to seek refuge as refugees in Soviet Russia. And so Kasparov went to Moscow along with the majority of Armenians. Now, Gorbachev did retain control politically of Azerbaijan and did keep it part of the Soviet Union. This is in the waning days of the Soviet Union. This is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the Soviet, and this was, and the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan was actually the first part of the Soviet Union to try to declare independence. Many others would follow suit in the months to come. But this was a very, very tough time for the people of Azerbaijan. It was also a very, very tough time for Kasparov. Kasparov went to Moscow. He had a wife there named Maria. They had a 2-room flat, very small and modest, so Kasparov had a roof. But he didn't have anywhere for his mom or the rest of his family to stay, and so they had to make arrangements. Fortunately, Kasparov had, connections, and he had some money, so he was able to do that. But there were lots and lots of Armenians, my acquaintance included, who were displaced from Azerbaijan, which has a climate similar to Houston, to Moscow in the middle of the winter, and many of them were wearing T-shirts when they arrived in 20 degree below zero temperatures. So that was a very, very tough transition. So this created lots of problems for Kasparov. One, he was trying to juggle a lot of different things at once. He was trying to juggle his training for the 1990 World Championship. He was trying to juggle his presidency of the Grandmasters Association. He was trying to juggle his personal life and his training, which had been displaced. He wasn't able to keep all the balls in the air. He had a falling out with Alexander Nikitin in March. He had a falling out with Gorbachev the day after he arrived in Moscow, January 18th, 1990. And he very soon after that, he resigned from the Communist Party. In May, he became the deputy head of the Democratic Party. And politically, Kasparov changed. Personally, his life is in, I don't want to say shambles, but it's in upheaval. And he still has to prepare for this match against Karpov. So he gets Alexander Belyavsky to come and help him prepare. And actually a little known fact, you'll note that in the picture there are no flags on the table, and that's because Kasparov wanted the flag to be the Russian tricolor, which is the current flag of Russia. Karpov wanted the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union, and they couldn't agree, so FIDE said, well, we just won't put flags on the table. It was a very contentious time politically. Now, Kasparov won this match through some really good chess, and I'm going to show you, game 20, where Kasparov, and Warren will walk you through it, where Kasparov had a dramatic win. I do want to let you know that that Kasparov won the championship, and part of that was receiving a chessboard studded with diamonds, and that Kasparov sold for $300,000. and which was about 10 million rubles at that exchange rate at the time, and all that money went to support Armenian refugees. And in fact, my acquaintance told me that she is thankful to this day that Kasparov sold that prize to basically buy her family, and thousands of other Armenians a winter coat, hat, and shoes so that they could get through the winter. So Kasparov doesn't talk about that much in his, and you wouldn't really know it from talking to him, but this is another, the Chernobyl incident was the first case. The Armenian refugee crisis was the second case where Kasparov has been very financially generous to support people in great need. So I think he deserves props for that. Incidentally, does anybody know who bought that diamond-studded chessboard?
Was it Kherson?
It was KhersonElyumazov, yeah, in 1990. And Kherson keeps it, probably still has it to this day. And Kasparov obviously despises the guy, but there you go. And at one time he was glad to take his money.
Kasparov talked about the incident and all that in his Kasparov part.
Yeah, in volume 2 he does. Yeah. Okay, so before Warren shows you game number 20, I want to show you a neat little video. This is actually on YouTube, and this is footage from Kasparov walking you through his reasoning in this game when he makes a very critical peace sacrifice against Karpov. And I'm showing you this so that you can see a little insight into how Kasparov thinks. He's known for his calculation, and he's known for his, Warren has talked about the depth of his ability to calculate, but I want you to see it in action because it's pretty remarkable. So I'm going to play for you. I first need to turn back on the system sound. I'm going to play for you a little clip, which you can find on YouTube, demonstrating, it's called Kasparov's lightning calculation.
No, the moves that Karpov was so unhappy with. Queen e8. He felt this was a critical error. Does the champion share his opinion on this move?
Knight takes h6.
So he did not see this move?
I didn't calculate it properly. I knew that it should win.
I saw you playing very quickly this move with the ball.
It's just several lines. White's winning because I have 7-piece attack, 2 bishops, 2 knights, 2 rooks, and is attacked to queen. He has some pieces protected. Okay, rook, 2 pawns, and bishop, and maybe queen. Okay, we can change. It's an equal change. I change 1 attacking piece for 1 defensive piece, but I have enough pieces to make.
So let's have a look. Knight
h6, he played c3.
And now, why didn't he take?
Okay, if he takes here, it's very interesting. Knight takes d6. Now I can show you many good interesting lines. Number 1, if he's trying to escape with him, queen d7. Then I played queen g4. Wins. If he takes here, then bishop takes g7, mate.
So bishop takes,
queen takes.
So this is mate.
Mate, yes. If he takes
your queen now.
Wait, so yes. Then check. And he cannot,
because of
check, and this is pinned. The pawn is pinned. And the king g8 is a mate in several moves. Bishop h7, bishop g6, and queen h7 mate. If he takes my queen, then it's a very nice combination. Check, the only move. Check, check, king f7, bishop g6, check, king g8, the only moves. Bishop f5, bishop e6, king d8, bishop takes e5, check, and bishop takes b7.
And so you have a nice investment, which is a rook up. After this combination.
Yes, and but it's not the end of the story. Actually, this line I saw at the board, but some other I found after. I just it proved that I was right. In this position, he could go queen h5. Here I play rook g5. You cannot take here because knight f7 check and take the queen. If you take here, it's interesting,
Knight
check, king h8, rook takes d1 and c3. And looks very good for black because it's now the pawn is closed, bishop is hanging, c2 is threatening, but suddenly knight f7 check, king d8, bishop g6, c takes b2, rook h5, and there is no defense. It's a mate, again mate.
It's wonderful.
It's mate again.
So you had the feeling for this position?
The feeling, yes. And final, I can show you the final. If he sacrificed queen, just in this position. If he sacrificed queen by playing queen takes e1, rook takes d6. Then I played queen e4, certain mate, knight d3, queen h4 check, king g8, bishop takes g7, and queen g4.
And no defense. You cannot defend because queen takes.
And that's all.
And this is over. All the pieces are disconnected.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know, Karpov saw it, but he felt that this is bad. He didn't take my knight.
He was confident in your calculations or in your feeling.
Maybe my feelings.
He was just
He
confident.
tried to close this bishop, you know. It's fine, but now this bishop is very strong.
So first of all, you gave one piece. Now you're sacrificing another piece.
Yeah, another piece. Okay, he killed this bishop, but this bishop now, he cannot close it anymore.
And he gave you some tempi, which is important in chess.
Yes, absolutely. And I still have 6 pieces.
So 6 instead of 7. This is not a big loss.
No, there's no pawn enough.
But one defender less, as you said before. So instead of 5, now 4 defenders.
Yes, and it's not enough. He played bishop c8, trying to
have some play.
Queen h4 check. If he goes king g8 and simple king h2 and no defense, knight g5.
Knight g5 and then queen h7.
And mate. He's trying to stop me. Rook h6, take, king h2.
Very strong move.
An important move, you know. Now my knight can go because rook is hanging without check. Queen e5, knight g5, king f6, rook e8. Now I have only 5 pieces in attack, but you know, just 3 defenders left. And it's just 5 very powerful.
So it was 7-5, 6-4, and now 5-3.
5-3, yes. 5-3, yes. And
So
anyway,
still the proportion is still very
but
difficult.
5-3 is much more dangerous than 7-5. You know? And for instance, any move with bishop b7 here, then it says I have the same combination, but mate. Immediately. He made the only move just to avoid the mate in 3, but anyway, it's here I played this very nice move. Queen takes h6.
This is fantastic because in a world championship, it is very unusual to have queen sacrifices.
Yes, this is true. Queen takes h6, knight f7 check. Queen g6, and here it's unforgivable mistake. You know, you should take with 0. Yeah, I know, but I just wanted to take all his pieces, you know, from the board.
You would mate with him just by removing the rook next move.
Yes, this is true. And knight e7, then I took on e7, bishop takes e7, rook g.
Rook mate here, checkmate, because no square for the king, and it is mated with the bishop.
Yeah, unfortunately, this bishop. Okay, I took with his queen with the bishop.
And I think the rest is just.
Okay, I have an extra rook again.
We are now about to witness the magic of Garry Kasparov. The world champion checks his calculations. It's really important to be accurate at a time like this. He has to restrain himself. Clearly, Kasparov's very excited here. One last check. Now the incredible move. Queen takes h6, sacrificing the queen. The time control's reached, and Kasparov lends Karpov his score sheet to copy up. And Karpov concedes. What an incredible game by Garry Kasparov.
One of my favorite chess videos of all time. So let's let Warren walk you through that one real quick so you can see it over the board and put yourself in Kasparov's shoes.
I love how enthusiastic he is in showing that. And then during the game, though, you can just see he sees blood on the board. You know, seeing Queen takes h6. You know, like the commentator says, you know, he's just so excited. He's just fidgeting and. Well, it's just fun to watch that. All right, so let's see how this game started. Okay, we had a Rui Lopez, and they had actually played this exact opening that occurred in the game several times in the match. So I'll show you up to the point where Karpov finally veered from, or Kasparov, sorry, veered from what he had been playing. So Karpov played, you know, his typically conservative black side of the Rui, and here he vied for the Zaitsev variation. Now, for black, the downside is that here white can play knight g5 and force repetition, but in a world championship match, a draw with black is quite acceptable, and especially for Kasparov, you don't want to draw, right? So he's not going to go for that. And if you have any questions about the opening, just let me know. But this was all some moves they had played in the match already. This interesting rook lift with rook a3. That's how his rook eventually got over to the E and G file. And this had already occurred in a couple other games. Okay, and here is where Kasparov had done some research and came to liking this move, rook e3. He had previously taken an f5, and that didn't end up being too successful. So this move is very interesting. I mean, really, to me, white's position looks amazingly coordinated. His bishops kind of point menacingly at white's king, and his rooks are already connected on the e file. I mean, to me, it's just a pretty position for white. I mean, most computers will tell you it's rather unclear, but I wouldn't want to play black in this position. Good. And this was another move that really strikes me as impressive. So he's rerouting this knight to this g4 square from where you saw it eventually took h6, right? And he also clears up the g file for this rook. So it allows it to take on a more direct attacking role. Yeah, this was probably a mistake. Kasparov points out that queen d7 was a better idea connecting these rooks, right? Chess principles still apply even to world champions. So he just failed to finish his development and came back to bite him. So now b3. Now the bishop has the option of coming to this long diagonal and participating in this attack on the king. And c4 was a little bit unclear, but the reasoning why he played this was to be able to play knight d3 and at least get rid of one of these attacking white bishops. Now again, it was probably a good idea to try to connect his rooks with queen d7. Finally getting this bishop into the game. And now the position's really opening up and getting interesting. Yeah, and here it was probably Kasparov's first mistake. Now, interestingly enough, at that time, there was for the first time, Deep Thought, a chess computer, was participating in the commentary for the game, and Deep Thought, one of the computers there, actually found this move, queen h5, and it was a really sick idea in that if you take this rook on e3, queen h6, king g8, and now white has a dagger move.
Knight g5.
Yeah, knight g5. Because if black takes, we have this beautiful checkmate.
Yeah.
This crossfire. It's very pretty. Yeah, so Deep Thought actually found this at the time, which I find pretty impressive. I mean, this was just 1990. I mean, computers back then still weren't very strong. I mean, Kasparov's matches with Deep Blue wouldn't take place until another 7 years. 7, 8 years, you know. So it's pretty cool to have found that.
He did play Deep Thought, I think, in 90 or 91 and beat it.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know his matches with Deep Blue didn't take place until later, but I didn't know he played Deep Thought earlier. Okay. I think Deep Thought was just an earlier iteration of Deep Blue, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but anyway, he played Rook G3 and Rook E6, trying to defend this H6 point. And here, Knight G4 was a bit optimistic. And in the beginning of the video, you kind of see him talking about, you hear him say the word mistake. And it was because a better idea would have been Knight F3, trying to go Knight F G5, and then Queen H5. It was a better way to attack. And the reason is because after knight g4, Karpov missed this move knight d3, which according to Kasparov's logic, it'll force Kasparov to lose an attacker. So he doesn't have that same superiority that he was talking about. So this would have made the game much more interesting. White's still better, but it's far less clear now. Okay. By the way, Karpov played queen e8, and as we saw in the game, knight takes h6, right? c3 trying to cut off the bishop, but knight f5 and queen g4. Of course, we saw this. King h2 was a cool prophylactic move. I don't know if he went over it very quickly, but do you guys know why he played king h2?
So there wouldn't be an attack on the rook with check.
Exactly. So now he's threatening knight g5, and if black takes the queen, it's no longer check, and he can simply deliver mate.
Yeah.
So that's the threat, and that's the problem. So queen e5. I mean, at this point he has no defense, so it's hardly worth criticizing. And of course we have this beautiful queen sacrifice. And he talks in the book how he still doesn't forgive himself for missing just rook takes g6. Instead, he took with the bishop. Because it is a very pretty mate to just remove the rook. I mean, that's just beautiful. To meet a world champion like that's pretty amazing. Yeah, in the game he just took with the bishop and won a bunch of material. And then Karpov finally resigned. Down a couple exchanges, right? Yeah, I think that's just a really cool Kasparov game. It's just classic Kasparov, just tons of energy, just a ferocious attack, and you saw him going over the game just so enthusiastic. I mean, it's this classic Kasparov, pretty cool. Any questions about that game? I think it's a really fun attack. Now, he mentions before the game that somebody was comparing him to Tal, and they're saying that Tal is like a storm, just constant, rain and thunder beating down on you. But this person compared Kasparov to a tsunami. and Kasparov very humbly says, "Well said." You can hardly blame the guy. I mean, he was so good, right? But I just thought it was funny. All right.
Okay, so that 1990 match, which Kasparov won, would be the last title defense that Kasparov would play under the auspices of FIDE. And that concludes part one of the lecture. Part two, which is going to be February 25th, I believe, the last Wednesday in February, we're going to cover 1993 to the present. So as a sort of teaser, we'll talk about Biggest Mistake, talk about the separation between the PCA and FIDE, Kasparov's various games against various computers, how those went, the disappointment of that Kasparov never played in another FIDE championship, and then we'll talk about politics. And we'll talk about Kasparov, the political activist. We'll talk about Kasparov, the teacher. There's even a photo I found of Kasparov with a young Warren Harper, so that'll be fun. And then we'll finish with Kasparov's failed campaign for FIDE presidency and trace the roots all the way back to his quotes from the mid-'80s about FIDE and his views on its present state and its future. So the sources I used were primarily Kasparov's work itself. I used Child of Change, which was written in '87 by a very young 24-year-old Garry Kasparov. And Kasparov repeats a lot of the information. He plagiarizes himself, essentially, for his Kasparov on Kasparov series. Volume 3 just recently came out in November, and so this series is now complete. Essentially, he applied the same principles that he used for my great predecessor series, and he applied it to himself. And so it's primarily analysis. So I know Volume 2 contains like 100 games with full analysis that Kasparov has done, and the other volumes are similar. Volume 1 has a little more biographical information. And then the only book that I used that was not written by Kasparov was Soltis's treatise on Soviet chess. And I used that to kind of confirm some of my opinions about the Kasparov versus Karpov rivalry. Soltis is a little more objective about that, and I've used this book previously in other lectures and highly recommend it. As with all McFarlane hardcovers, the quality is outstanding. So by all means, if you have any questions about games or Kasparov's biography, assume for the time period of 1993, feel free to ask.
Did he ever play Fischer in a...
No, they never played. And Kasparov said, well, he said different things at different stages of his career. He was very thankful for Fischer because Fischer had established professional chess as a legitimate job. He changed the economics and the prize funding of chess and had brought chess to more worldwide prominence. But Kasparov was always pretty adamant in suggesting that if ever they were to play, it wouldn't be close, that Kasparov would win pretty handily. Kasparov said on a couple of occasions that, Fischer had been out of tournament chess for so long, essentially since 1972, that he was pretty out of touch with developments and that he was not in the same chess shape that he had been in previously. I don't think Kasparov knew, though, that Fischer was analyzing and avidly reading every piece of chess literature published from 1972 onward, just like he had always done. Of course, he did lose that experience playing tournament chess, but no, there is no evidence that they ever played. Kasparov did play a couple of secret training matches, but never against Fischer. I don't think Fischer would have dared to do that.